introduce who's on Zoom. We're not going to be able to see her. That would have been classier, but her name is Delegate Elizabeth Embry. Delegate Embry is from 43B, which is right here, and she is strongly supportive of many of the criminal justice reform bills that Major is supporting. Also, either here or coming is Dustin Branch. Dustin Branch is the staff person for Senator Mary Washington, who is, and Dustin is here, and Senator Mary Washington is working with, is also from 43 and working with us on looking at solitary. And then finally, is Vanessa Clark here? That's down to the V's, Barbara. So that's a little bit of a, okay. Not yet, but so Vanessa Clark is the staff person for Senator Phillips, who has a Delegate Phillips, who has agreed to sponsor the solitary bill. Are there any other elected officials here in the room or on Zoom that we should introduce, or their staff? Okay, great. So part of the Quaker tradition, which is what you're in a Quaker meeting house here, is that we begin each meeting with a moment of silence. So I'm going to ask that we do that. It's a moment when we can let go of all the many, many preoccupations that each one of us bring here, and a moment to center our hearts and our minds on the over 15,000 people who are living day after day, week after week, year after year behind bars in our Maryland prison system. So let's just take a moment of silence to begin our meeting. So now I would like to introduce our MC, Jose Santos Moreno. Works for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. That's our national Quaker advocacy reform. And he is Director for Justice Reform with FCNL. He leads the work on justice reform, on election integrity, and on policing. He helps to lead the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition, which is an alliance of more than 40 national faith groups advocating for the end of mass incarceration. He is a member of Friends Meeting of Washington and a regular attender here at Homewood Friends Meeting. And so it was a joy that I introduce Jose Santos Moreno. Thank you, Jose.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thank you, all of you, for coming to have this very important conversation. In my work on elections, it's important that you vote. It's really important. But what you do after means a lot too, and you're doing it right now. So thank you. Why justice reform is important? I've been fortunate. I haven't felt incarceration in my immediate family or my life. But what I have felt is profiling, being pulled over, having my car searched by 4 police officers, and all they find are water bottles and college textbooks. A police officer, this is all New Jersey, a police officer in New Jersey pulling me over because he thinks that I stole the car. It's under my mom's name. We don't have the same last name. So that just goes to show you that all of us have responsibility to fix these systems. And it's not an issue of red or blue. No party has a monopoly on not having it right. And this country has had a long storied history of not having it right on incarceration. Black people are have the disproportionate share of people who are incarcerated. They're incarcerated at much higher rates than their rates in the population. Um, and if you look at the entirety of the system, which is what I'm most aware of, I work at the federal level. Our rate of incarceration is about 700 or so per 100,000, and that puts us in the same um, neighborhood of other not so great actors like Russia, El Salvador, and Rwanda. So we aren't in particularly good company. We incarcerate a tremendous amount of people. When we have some problems here in Maryland as well. I did want to spend just a few moments talking about the Quaker role in incarceration. Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm not sure if I get it right, if it's Easton or Eastern. Eastern. Okay, good. Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania was started up as a facility to be more humane for correcting errors in society. Quakers got together to find a more humane solution to what was being done before the 19th century for individuals who commit wrongs. And the thinking was if you have a small cell, a chair, and a pinhole of light coming in, you can make penance for what you've done wrong by yourself. We had no idea that was solitary confinement, and we didn't know that it was torture and how incredibly, incredibly damaging and terrible it is for a person's mental health. So we have a role and a special responsibility to abolish solitary confinement. And it's something that I'm working on at the federal level right now with the End Solitary Confinement Act, which is a bill that I'm working on. That was introduced in the House and most recently introduced a companion legislation in the Senate as well. With that, I am very, very privileged and happy to introduce our first speaker. That is Miss Olinda Moyd. Olinda Moyd, Esquire, is a social justice champion who has dedicated her legal career to disrupting the machinery of mass incarceration through her prisoners' rights, parole, post-conviction, and reentry work. Her fight to free individuals from the carceral state reverberates through her journey as an attorney, professor, parole consultant, and community activist. She's currently the director of the Decarceration and Reentry Clinic at the American University Washington College of Law. She is an executive board member of the Maryland Alliance for Just Reform. So please put your hands together for Miss Olinda Moyd.
Thank you, Jose, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a PK, that means preacher's kid. So I grew up in a Baptist church. I know you could do better than that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, thank you. I am here to talk about the legislation that is a priority for the Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform, the Correctional Ombudsman legislation. And I do have a few slides that I'd like to just walk through in my 15 minutes that I have. Just starting with, if we could go to the first slide, just a reminder as to why this work is important. Why is it important for us to know what's happening to men and women behind bars? It was Angela Davis who said, prisons do not disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. We have to remember that every man and woman who is behind bars, whatever their DC number is, DOC number is, they are a human being. And Brian Stevenson, Another of my favorite quotes reminds us that each of us is so much more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And if we could just go to the next slide, because I am a person of faith, I just wanted to highlight a couple of scriptures that remind us, remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. So I just wanted to lay that groundwork. In the state of Maryland, we have institutions that are all throughout the state, from the Eastern Shore to Western Maryland. The Department of Correctional Services in the state of Maryland is called the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. We know that we cannot rely on them to monitor themselves. There needs to be outside oversight. If we could go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight the number of men and women who are currently behind bars in the state of Maryland. At the end of 2023, that number sat at 15,425. It's also important to note that while in some jurisdictions, the number of folks who are incarcerated has gone down during and since the pandemic, in the state of Maryland, the number has gone up in the last year. It's also important to look at the racial disparity, and I hope that you can see the race breakdown on this next slide. While African Americans make up 31% of the general population in the state of Maryland, we make up 71% of men and women who are behind bars. Quite a striking disparity. So it's incumbent upon us to know what's happening on a regular basis, and that's what this legislation calls for, shining a light behind the prison walls throughout the state. If you could go to the next slide, I'd like to just highlight some of the specifics about the bill. First, there's the numbers, the bill numbers. Senate Bill 0134 and House Bill 0297. The purpose of the bill is to provide oversight, shine a light on what's happening in our prisons. Several states have already established an ombudsman's office, 20 states to be exact, and federal legislation was recently passed establishing correctional oversight. Our lead sponsor on the Senate side is Senator Shelley Heddleman. She's been our sponsor for the last 3 years. She's from Baltimore County. On the House side, our lead sponsor is Deborah Davis, along with co-sponsors Bartlett, Crutchfield, and Long. Why do we need correctional oversight? We know that incarceration itself is trauma. There is also unhealthy environments, abuse, dangerous conditions that exist in our institutions. So you might ask the question, well, I can't believe that there's not already oversight over corrections, right? Well, there is. Guess who does the oversight? Sarah got it right. So there is an organization called a commission, the Maryland Commission for Correctional Standards. They are charged in our state with overseeing and providing some kind of accountability for what's happening in our institutions. But guess who sits on the commission? current wardens and former wardens. So can we really expect them to monitor themselves or their friends who are running institutions? We need to have outside oversight. Just yesterday, I received a report that on the Eastern Shore, Eastern Correctional Institution, there was an assault that took place, an officer on a member of the population. And after the assault took place, they realized it was on camera. And the officer and his friends decided to destroy the video. The FBI has now stepped in, and an officer has now been charged with destroying evidence. Those are the kinds of things that we need to have independent oversight for. If you've been reading the paper about what's happening in our institutions with the correctional officers, you know that there have been scandal after scandals. But the correctional oversight is specifically designed not just to receive information and conduct investigations that come from the men and women on the inside, but also from the staff. It would provide a place for staff to also lodge complaints. Volunteers who go in and out of the institutions on a regular basis. And also family members who get those phone calls in the middle of the night about what's happening to their loved one. So the correctional ombudsman would be a place where several members of the population in general can reach out for information, investigation, some kind of resolution. The bill calls for the office to be created within the Office of the Attorney General. If we could go to the next slide. It's important to note that the Attorney General, the current Attorney General, is in support of the bill and has pledged that support. It's in the newspaper, so he was quoted in the newspaper. He can't go back on his quote. And he also participated in an event that Major had in September, where he also pledged his support. Again, the office would, in response to complaints or on their own initiative, be able to investigate administrative acts, acts of independent reviews and assessments of health services, including mental health services, substance abuse treatment. They would also be able to look into the expansion or building of correctional facilities. Some of you may know that a few years ago, there was a commitment, legislation passed actually, to build a pre-release center for women. There is none in the state of Maryland. There are for men. There is no pre-release unit for women, but that has not been built, which means that the women who are, since there's only one facility in the state of Maryland for women who are on maximum security level, medium security level, minimum security level, those going out for work release are all going from the same institution. And all of the experts will tell you that it is not good practice to have women who are on the lowest level going back to a maximum security facility at night after work. They would also have the ability to oversee educational and vocational programs, and also review and assist with setting up agency policies. One of the real important features of the bill is that the ombuds office would have the authority to go in and inspect facilities unannounced, which makes a difference. One of our lead sponsors, Delegate Davis, she always talks about when she goes into the facility to do the tours with her colleagues, she can smell fresh paint. So she knows that they just spruce up the place because of the visit. So that's very important. They would also have the authority to interview personnel. And there are provisions in the bill that talk about whistleblower protection, so that whether it's a person who's housed in the population or a staff member who provides information, they would be protected. They would also have access to records maintained by the agency, including disciplinary records and grievance records. So there is a grievance process that's set up in the institution. It allows individual members of the population to be able to write on a form what they are grieving. What is your problem? What is going on? What is it you're asking for? But guess who they have to give the grievance to in order for it to go anywhere? The correctional staff. And in some cases, the very officer that they're grieving against. They would also have the authority to, or be required to report on a regular basis to the General Assembly and to the governor regarding their findings. And it's important to have the reporting out on a regular basis, because it will help the public to know what's going on, but it will also help the office to identify where the problems are. At what institutions do you see the same problems coming up over and over? What are systemic issues, right, that the ombuds office can address before they become wider issues? The legislation also calls for the creation of an advisory board. And there is specific language in the legislation that says at least one member of this advisory board has to be a returning citizen, someone with inside knowledge. The legislation, at this point, the legislation would start in the Jessup area. If you know anything about how our institutions are clustered in Maryland, we have a cluster of facilities in Jessup, and someone on a recent phone call asked, why Jessup? There are problems in Eastern Shore, there are problems in Western Maryland, and we know that, but the Jessup area encompasses at least one pre-release center, several institutions, male institutions, the one female institution. And so we believe that by starting in the Jessup area, it would give us a diversity of the types of institutions that the office would be able to monitor. On the next slide, I have highlighted some of the quotes that we have received from the men and women on the inside who support this legislation. As a part of our strategy in getting ready for the hearings that are coming up, and I will talk about that in a minute, I wanted to make sure that the voices from the men and women on the inside were heard. And so I made my rounds to the institutions, provided guidance, and asked the men and women to write out and send to Major information about what their issues are, what why they support this legislation, and how they think it will change things. And these are just some of the responses that we got back. And so far, we've collected about 92 of these letters. Mr. H, who's at JCI, says in his letter, 3 major aspects of prison life medical, dietary, commissary have all been privatized, contracted out with very little oversight. The three major operations that keep prisons going. Mr. P, who's at MCIJ, wrote that his personal property was destroyed, which included his trial transcripts and his father's funeral photos. And he wrote an ARP, a grievance, but nothing has happened. He says that the officers would literally rip them up in front of his face. Mr. M, who's also at JCI, writes, the correctional staff know that as long as everything is handled in-house, they are free to operate with impunity. And then we have quotes from two women at MCIW. One woman who's a breast cancer survivor has recently complained of chest pains, and she was told that it's probably because of the mattress that she's sleeping on. Even though the healthcare provider and the chronic care doctor, which she named in her letter, promised her that she would see an oncologist, she's been still waiting for 6 months for that to happen. Miss C, who's also at MCIW, says that she had pneumonia and was told for weeks that nothing was wrong with her. Eventually, she got so sick that she had to be taken out to medical and was hospitalized for 2 weeks. So we are presenting this legislation for the third year in a row. Last year, it made it through the Senate, but it just did not make it to the House side in enough time to get a vote. So we are introducing this legislation to give a voice to those men and women who we hear from on a regular basis, but again, to also shine a light on what's happening behind those prison walls. We do have a date for our first hearing. If you're taking notes, we do have a date for our first hearing. It will be before the Senate on February the 7th at 2:00 p.m. I encourage you all to join us in Annapolis on that day. If you have an MGA account set up already, and someone may be tasked with covering this, if you have an account set up already, it's very easy to sign up to testify in person, to submit written testimony. If you're not comfortable with doing either of those things, we still invite you to come and just show your presence by being there to support us. I'll just close by saying, I'm often asked, why do you care so deeply? Do you have family members who are incarcerated? I get that question all the time. Why are you so outspoken? But I think that people are asking the wrong question. I think the question is not, why have I chosen to be so outspoken, but why have others chosen to remain silent? It was Dr. King who said that the history will record that the greatest tragedy is not the stride and glamour of the bad people, but it's the appalling silence of the good people. So I encourage you to join us in support of this legislation. Join us in Annapolis, join us at our major meetings. You will hear more about what we have scheduled for Lobby Day tomorrow. And I thank you for hearing me out this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ms. Moy. That was excellent. Our next speaker is Mr. Bob Rudy, and he'll be speaking on the Mandela Act. A few words about Mr. Rudy. He represents Interfaith Action for Human Rights, an organization of people of faith and allies who educate and advocate in Maryland, DC, and Virginia for correction systems to abolish unnecessarily punitive practices such as solitary confinement. He served for many years on the Maryland Alliance for Just Reform's Executive Committee as Executive Director of Maryland Legal Service Corporation and Coalition for Legal Services in Washington, D.C., and as Chief Attorney and Legislative Coordinator of Maryland Legal Aid. He currently is legal counsel for mediation and consulting in Darlington, Maryland. Please put your hands together for Mr. Bob Rudy.
Thank you, Jose. Passed out the brochure. Ms. Hosh will be talking a little bit more about the organization in a few minutes. I'm going to give an overview on why we're trying to get reform on solitary confinement in the state. We're treating people really, really badly, very badly. By the way, the ombuds bill, people will be able to complain to the ombuds about their misuse of solitary confinement. So I'm very, very supportive of that bill. That's going to pass this year. We hope this does as well. I may repeat a couple of things that Olinda said, just some of the stats a bit, try not to too much. Since 2016, under legislation proposed by the Interfaith Action for Human Rights, the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services is required to submit annual reports on the use of restrictive housing, solitary confinement. Use both terms. We're more familiar with solitary confinement. They tend to use both terms. I may as well, but it's the same thing. According to the most recent report filed for FY 2022, we haven't gotten the one for the most recent fiscal year, 24.8% of the state incarcerated persons experienced restricted housing, solitary confinement during this period. By the way, I'm working off of an outline. There's about 100 copies floating around the room, so please take some with you and pass them around. This report indicated that the average stay per person in restrictive housing during that time was 34.8 days. This was an increase in restrictive housing, solitary confinement of over 30% from the prior year. We understand that many people were retained in solitary confinement for up to 23 hours a day. 23 hours a day. And here's where I'm going to repeat Jose a bit and Olinda, some stats. Black persons constitute approximately 29% of the Maryland population, but 71% of the Maryland prison population. In 2021, Maryland blacks were incarcerated in state prisons at the rate of 594 per 100,000 compared to whites at 112 per 100,000. Blacks are also placed in restrictive housing, solitary confinement, about 3 times the rate of the white population. How about that? I also mentioned Quakers have been involved with Native American affairs for a long time as well. 0.2% of the Maryland population are Native Americans, 0.5% of the state prison population are Native Americans. They're also placed in restrictive housing substantially higher than the white incarcerated population. A United Nations standard indicates that placement in restrictive housing, solitary confinement for more than 15 days constitutes torture. That's why the bill this past year named the Mandela Act. We hope to continue that name this year. We'll see when the bill is actually filed. We've suggested such for the experiences that Nelson Mandela went through in South Africa for years and years. Persons placed in restrictive housing, solitary confinement for several reasons, including disciplinary violations, some serious mental illness, how's that? And other administrative purposes, fairly vague. Persons identified, who self-identify as LGBTQ are often placed in such housing, although they're incarcerated in facilities in the state of Maryland as per their identified gender at birth. Interesting. Persons can also request such housing if they feel like they're endangered by being housed in the general population. Some people ask to be placed in restrictive housing, solitary confinement. As Natasha White, who's the IHR's Director of Community Engagement, will discuss shortly, extended placement in such restrictive housing, solitary confinement can have very serious mental, emotional, and physical effects and disabilities. Maryland is estimated to use solitary confinement at about twice the rate of average of other states. There are things I'm proud of in this state. Our prison system is not one of it. Our use of solitary confinement certainly is not one. We need to do a much better job. 12 states around the United States, including New Jersey, Connecticut, Nevada, New York, Delaware, Maine, others, have enacted some substantial restrictive housing and solitary confinement reduction programs over the past 10 or 12 years. Plus recently in New York City, Natasha can talk about that, and it's pending in California. These provide excellent models for Maryland implementation. Also, legislation was introduced in the U.S. Congress in 2023, as you mentioned, to reform solitary confinement in federal prisons. Numerous such states report substantial cost savings from the reduction in the use of solitary confinement, increasing revenues, releasing revenues that can be used for improved mental and physical health care, rehabilitation, education, and other services to help people come back into the community. I've got a couple of studies here with me that have talked about the findings of substantial reduction in prison costs as a result of reducing the use of solitary confinement. Led by Interfaith Action for Human Rights and other organizations, the Maryland Mandela Act was filed in the 2023 Maryland General Assembly with hearings before the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committees. It didn't come up for a vote. Talk about that in a minute. The union representing prison staff supported the legislation. A lot of support for the legislation from organizations across the state in Maryland, faith-based, nonprofit organizations, a lot. The bill wasn't put up to a vote. There was this decision to require a interim study under legislative leadership on solitary confinement in the state. It never took place. Restrictive housing legislation, solitary confinement legislation is being filed in the 2024 General Assembly by Delegate N. Scott Phillips, District 10, Baltimore County, and we believe in the Senate by Mary Washington, District 43, Baltimore City, as lead House and Senate sponsors. It's our understanding. We also know we're going to have a number of other people that are going to be supported and sign on as co-sponsors of the legislation as well. So we're going to have a lot of good discussion this time. This year's proposed legislation applies only to state incarceration facilities, not to local jails. Last year, it applied to local jails as well as state prisons. The local counties opposed the legislation, and that was one of the things that really held it up. Okay, we're going to focus on state prisons this time and move forward, hopefully, with legislation. Among other provisions, the bills will generally restrict the use of solitary confinement to not more than 15 days at a time and not more than 17 hours a day. The bills require training for prison staff for implementing the changes. It was one of the, last year there was concern over the fiscal note. The training will be not as expensive this year as would have been anticipated last year. We also thought the fiscal note was greatly exaggerated. We know there's going to be savings. There is cost in terms of the transition, no question about that. But we also think we may be able to get some foundation support to assist with the training to save on state revenues. There's going to be a lot of discussion about fiscal issues, budget issues in general some of this time. We don't want that to be a block to passing this legislation. I think on the Zoom is two volunteers, attorneys with Interfaith Action for Human Rights. One's in San Diego, California right now. It's coming in, hopefully. That's Bruce Turnbull and Margaret Berry. They drafted the bill that we have circulated to our friends in the General Assembly. And if you have questions afterwards, I'm sure they can address some of your any questions and any suggestions you may have. We really hope that we expect hearings on the bill sometime in mid-February, early March at the latest. We'll let you know when the hearings are going to be. We need your support. We need your testimony. We need you talking to your legislators, particularly on the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee and the House Judiciary Committee, where these bills are going to be heard. When they hear from you, they give a lot of listen. So we need your help. We need this legislation passed. We need this reform in Maryland. So if you have any questions, save them for the rest of our presentations. Thank you very much for letting me support this legislation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Rudy. Thank you so much, Mr. Rudy. Now, I did want to take just a moment, and mention a case that will likely help you understand what solitary confinement does. And preface this by saying, Ms. White, I hope I'm not taking away from your presentation. You might mention this, but Khalif Browder was a young man in New York City who was incarcerated for 3 years for allegedly stealing a backpack. If that weren't terrible enough, he was incarcerated in solitary. He was put in solitary confinement for 800 days. 800 days. After his incarceration, he would go on to die by a violent suicide. And then his mother died of a heart attack in 2016. And it was literally said that she died of a broken heart. Solitary confinement is so terrible. And I'm really glad for your efforts to try to put some serious limits on it. With that, I do want to introduce our next speaker. Ms. Tasha White is a formerly incarcerated survivor of solitary confinement. Since her release, she's been a leader in the Close Rikers, Halt Solitary, Bail Reform, and Less is More campaigns. She is a current director of community engagement for Interfaith Action for Human Rights, IAHR, and the National Unlock the Box campaign state representatives for both Maryland and Virginia. Please put your hands together for Ms. Natasha White.
Sorry. Thank you for mentioning Khalif. Khalif's brother Hakeem is a good friend of mine, and I fought side by side with him on the Halt Solitary bill. What happened to Khalif Browder is insane. Insane. And it just shows you the severity of that boy took his life. He was home. He was not in jail anymore. That heart attack his mother had was in the same room he killed himself in. So this is serious. Because of my dog and not knowing where to park, I left my speech in the car. So we're going to get jiggy with it from here, okay? First, I would like to thank everyone here for attending this much needed conversation. I address you today not solely as the Director of Community Engagement for Interfaith Action for Human Rights, but as a survivor of the harsh reality of solitary confinement. My personal journey through 4 years of isolation stemmed directly from my marital connection and no wrongdoing of my own. So all those terrible reasons they say they lock people in with no sunlight, that's the most uncommon reasons you can go. Resulting in enduring physical and mental trauma that remains etched in my mind and heart. The darkness of solitary confinement became a twisted comfort, causing me to live as isolated as possible, making it challenging for me to readjust to what society deems normal. The haunting echoes of screams and banging persist in my sleep, a constant reminder of horrors I faced. The lingering stench of feces smeared on my cell wall, left by a woman who tragically ended her own life after spending 6 years in that same cell. They never even cleaned the cell after she killed herself. Never even cleaned the cell. Compels me to obsessively clean with the strongest disinfectants. I find myself easily agitated, lacking patience and self-control. These are mere reflections of the scars solitary confinement has left on my psyche. Despite my struggles, countless individuals remain trapped in the darkness of their minds while confined. Prolonged isolation, misleadingly labeled as restorative housing. We call that verbal gymnastics in Brooklyn. Labeled restorative housing is a form of torture condoned and abused within our state's prisons way too much. Studies consistently show that prolonged isolation yields no positive outcomes. Restorative housing, far from addressing underlying issues, exacerbates issues, leading to increased violence, recidivism, anger, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The outcomes of long-term confinement often include mental health deterioration, self-mutilation, and tragically suicide. Yet it has become the first resort, the first rather than the last in our prisons. Interfaith Action for Human Rights stands as a voice for people of faith and their allies, dedicated to advocating for reform in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. Our primary focus revolves around eliminating punitive measures like solitary confinement, promoting rehabilitation, and successful reentry of citizens. Since they did all the statistics and I left my paper in the car, we're gonna jump into just the organization itself. IHR took shape in 2015 with the formation of 11 board directors. Rabbi Charles Feinberg, previously part of the steering committee, assumed the role as executive director. He's been our director. He retired, came back. He thinks he's interim. We're not letting him go. The following year, the board made a strategic decision to concentrate efforts on ending prolonged isolation in state prisons and combating anti-Muslim bigotry. By 2017, it became clear that effectively addressing both issues, anti-Muslim bigotry and the abuse of prolonged isolation, was challenging in light of other organizations actively involved in countering anti-Muslim bigotry. IAHR made a deliberate choice to shift its focus exclusively to ending the abuse of prolonged isolation in regional prisons and jails. By 2020, IHR's mission had broadened to encompass not only the conditions of confinement, but also other human rights abuses and rehabilitative alternatives. Consequently, IHR strives to halt the inhumane treatment of prisoners, particularly those held in prolonged isolation within Virginia, DC, and the Maryland penal system. IHR, in collaboration with coalition's partners, in 2016 introduced a bill mandating the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services to report comprehensive statistics on the use of solitary confinement, a bill that later became law. The 2019 legislative session saw IHR's successful passage of HB 1001, which restricted the placement of minors in restorative housing. In 2020, IHR played a key role in drafting and passing legislation that prohibited the direct release of individuals from solitary to the community. Instead, those incarcerated in solitary must be transferred out 6 months prior to their release, during which they receive a comprehensive range of medical and psychological services. The 2024 Maryland Mandela Act aims to redefine and restrict the use of restrictive housing in correctional facilities. It introduces procedures for placing incarcerated individuals in restorative housing and mandates training for hearing officers and personnel involved in their supervision, emphasizing the development of de-escalation methods for handling hostile actions in correctional facilities. I implore each and every one of you to stand with us in advocating for torture-free Maryland. Prison should be rehabilitative, not torturous. We should unite to ensure that Maryland's correctional system reflects our commitment to human rights and justice. Solitary confinement is not just about prisons. It's about people, and human rights pertain to all people. I'm gonna say this. When I came home from prison, I did 15 years in total in New York State. As soon as I got to the state jail from Rikers Island, I was put in solitary. I didn't eat, they didn't dress me, they took me right there with the clothes I had on, and while all the rest of the young ladies who I had been in Rikers Island with for about 7 months, we were friends. I didn't see them again ever until I got out of prison. They kept me in that cell for 4 years, strictly because of my husband's alleged gang status. He was in a male facility, matter of fact, federal facility at that. But when I started this fight, I did not start because I myself was in solitary. And the 18 years that my husband was in prison, he did 12 in Lewisburg Supermax Federal Penitentiary. And my house was a war zone. He was totally emotionally disconnected. So yes, I still hear the feet against the wall while the girl is trying to catch herself after she's hung herself and changed her mind. I still hear the screams of officers screaming, "Cut her down, cut her down." I still hear boot prints and footmarks and walkie-talkies when they were assaulting, multiple officers assaulting a woman in a cell. But what I hear the most is the anger and the cry in my heart about my failed marriage because you ruined my husband. So yes, I'm not from Maryland. Doesn't matter. I'm not from Virginia. Doesn't matter. I'm what they call a disruptor. And Unlock the Box has deemed me the serial solitary slayer. I'm also on the Federal Anti-Solitary Task Force because I'm shutting it down and I need all of your help so that nobody goes through what I went through before. Thank you for your time.
To put it lightly, that was incredibly powerful. Thanks so much, Ms. White. Now, my document doesn't say this, but I think I'm supposed to say the Honorable Phil Karoom. Phil Karoom is a member of Annapolis Friends Meeting and is our next speaker. He is a former prosecutor and serves as a state trial judge, now in senior status. But today, he speaks only as a representative of the nonprofit group Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform. Phil also recently was appointed by the governor to serve on the state's Justice Reinvestment Oversight Board, whose mission involves repurposing government savings from reduced incarceration to more effective alternatives to incarceration. Please put your hands together for the Honorable Phil Karoom.
I see how you can kick this thing and make that sound. Let me initially say thank you, friends, for organizing this and considering your support for these issues. I notice in the attendance is Molly Finch, who's also our clerk and coordinator for Quaker Voice of Maryland, a group where, not limited to criminal justice, friends have a chance to learn more about the legislation that is going to be in the state legislature each year. And we encourage everyone to visit Quaker Voice. I came to this as a former prosecutor and a new Quaker, realizing that integrity should be part of my life and my work. In other words, that what I tried to do on the job should be consistent with what I believed in. And what I believed in at the time was that when someone committed a crime, they needed to fix their life and get out and be better, not do it again. And that would improve public safety, their communities, the families. And what became very clear to me pretty quickly in my work was that prison doesn't work. It doesn't fix things. Just increasing someone's sentence from a year to 5 years to 10 years doesn't make them better. What makes them better is education, job training, drug treatment, mental health. And none of that is happening in Maryland state prisons. A lot of it happens in our juvenile institutions if a kid is bad enough that they have to go there. But in our state prisons, very little of that happens. There are only 5 drug treatment providers for 15,000 prison inmates, and they are not able to help them all. When people are in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, they're not able to get education or job training. Even if it were there, and it's not in sufficient quantity, there's very little in the way of counseling. So the mission of Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform, or MAJOR as we call it, is to try to shrink the size of our prisons to the point where the only folks who would be incarcerated for any substantial period of time would be people who are literally dangerous and need to be there, and there's no other way to keep communities safe. If the prisons shrank, there would be more money and more resources to do the things that do work. Education, job training, mental health, substance abuse treatment. So how would one start? MAJOR and other people who have studied this, there have been federal programs that have endorsed this concept going back to George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and even persisted into the former president's administration, which say that shrinking the prisons is a good idea and repurposing those same resources is a good idea. It's called justice reinvestment. Where in justice reinvestment would you start to cut the prison population without making things more dangerous for the public? In MAJOR, we talk about the front door, the back door, and what's happening behind the walls. I'm going to start with the back door because it's very easy to understand. The back door is, what is it that lets you know that it's okay to release people from prison without endangering the public? Studies have shown that if someone reaches the age of 60 years old in prison, or if someone has a serious medical problem so that they're disabled, in effect, their odds of recidivism are tiny, like 1 to 3% of those people will get into any kind of trouble again, and almost never violent crime. And in the state of Maryland, it is a substantial number of folks. Olinda, what percentage? What number? Okay, it's a large number. There are probably, I think, more than 1,000 people. The cost of one person being in prison for 1 year in the state of Maryland is at least $43,000. And I saw very recently an official number saying if you add the overhead, in other words, what it costs to operate the building and the heat and the electricity and so forth, it actually goes up to over $59,000 per year. So, and if you are an older person, a person with medical problems, which is probably the majority of older people in state prison, your bill is higher still, because sooner or later, when they get around to it, your medical bills may double the cost. Maybe you're 75, 100,000 per year for those people. So if you take 1,000 people and save $75,000 per year, that is a lot of money that one could spend on drug treatment, mental health, job training, et cetera. You could send a lot of people to college. You could send a lot of people to drug treatment and so forth. So that would be one way. And there is on the yellow piece of paper, if folks got it when you came in, a bill which is called Medical and Geriatric Parole. And I'm looking to see where it says that. Even if you don't see it on this yellow piece of paper, and we may have not got it on in good condition, another way for you to find about this and other bills is to go to the website, which is For major, it's Maryland Alliance 4, MA4JR. If you type in MA4JR on your browser, you don't have to type anything else. You will land at our website. And if you then look on the landing page and click where it says legislation, 2024 will drop down. You can click there and you will see the bill number of every bill, the hearing date of each, the hearing for those bills, and reference material to tell you what the good things are about these bills. There also is, as discussed on the back of this yellow page, an opportunity for you to sign up to receive information which is called Get Involved. After legislation, all the way to the right, Get Involved. And if you go to that page and put in your name, email, and your home address, you may ask, why do we want your home address? We are not going to drive by your house. It is because there is a computer program we have which will tell you who your legislators are. And when your legislator is on a committee that is going to vote on an important bill, you will get an email saying, your legislator is going to vote on that this week. You know, you have the chance to make a phone call, to send an email. And we even have a program called Muster, where we will have written the email for you. You have the chance to just click and send it to your legislator saying, we want you to vote for this bill, or you can modify it. I have digressed because like Natasha, if I have notes there in my car, but I'm going to talk about two other types of bill. We talked about the back door, all the people that you can let out who are basically harmless, who will not cause any problems to our public safety. On the front door, there are bills that are called the Juvenile Reform Act and bills that relate to how police can handle juveniles. The Juvenile Reform Act is a bill which says currently there are two ways that juveniles get charged and possibly sent into custody. One of them is juvenile facilities, which, as I said, have got drug treatment, counseling, job training, education that would make them better. And the other is if they are charged as adults, where they are sent into adult prison for a much longer time, and they will get none of those things, while the taxpayers are spending $59,000 per year. Currently, state's attorneys have the option. They don't have to ask a judge. They don't have to ask a social worker. They can just consult the election campaign schedule and what their supporters are saying about being tough on crime, and they can just charge a large number of kids as adults and send them into that system unless the defense objects and there's a hearing, but there's a presumption that if they charge them as an adult, that they should go that way unless someone convinces the court otherwise. What this Juvenile Reform Act would do is take away that presumption and say we can charge them only as juveniles, and then the state has to prove that it will be better for them to be charged as adults. And the burden will be on the state to make that proof. These two bills that I've just mentioned, the geriatric medical parole and the Juvenile Reform Act, to say only start kids in the system as juveniles, would not cost the state 1 penny, because the systems already exist for parole review. The question is just how high a hurdle is it? And the system already exists for charging kids either as juvenile or adults. It's just a question of what the rules are. Would not cost 1 penny, but it would make our prisons smaller. It would make our communities safer. It would give us more money for drug treatment, job training, and the things that actually do work. There are other bills that, if you go to ma4jr.org and click the legislation page, you will see, but we have already been here a good amount of time. And so I want to stop and thank everyone again and say that I think any of us who have been speaking today would be happy to answer questions or to.
Oh, you're doing.
Was that it? Was that what I just said? Trying to see what else. So we are thrilled No, this is someone else's notes. To answer questions and to talk more about this if folks would like to talk more.
I think that what's next is just to announce that tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, Major is having Lobby Day. It's a virtual meeting. You can jump on to our virtual meeting, learn how to sign up for the MGA website, learn how to submit written testimony, talk more about our priorities, and it's going to be so easy. It's like 101 how to lift up your voice. So
And
we hope you will join us tomorrow. And then the other what's next is the date that I mentioned earlier, February the 7th at 2 o'clock in Annapolis. We hope that you will join us. The ombudsman bill is going to be heard that day, as well as the medical and geriatric parole bill. So it's going to be a long afternoon, but it's going to be so worth it for you to come and join us and support us.
right, and the skills that you would learn in the lobby day, which is Zoom, because they will not give us a room in Annapolis anymore with construction and COVID. That same skill, an elevator pitch, how to contact your legislator, you can use for anything, not just our bills. So if you are interested in working with Quaker Voice of Maryland to support death with dignity or end of life legislation or reproductive justice, come to our lobby day and you will learn how to do those things better as well.
If I could just do one thing, and I'm sorry, I'm a professor, and so I get a microphone and but just one, I will not interrupt your program, but I do think it's important for us to just take a minute, because I see several folks in the audience. If we could ask folks who are directly impacted by the system, if you have been, if you're comfortable, if you could stand, we want to just show you that we love you, we support you, and we appreciate your being with us today. Thank you.
Got our brochure, it's got our website on it.